All right. Well, again, it's good to be here with you on this Sunday. And today we're actually starting a new sermon series. And we'll be going through the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. And we're going through this book, the book of Daniel, because here in this book we find wisdom for how to navigate our way through a world that makes it very difficult to follow after Jesus. In the book of Daniel, we find the wisdom that we need to follow Jesus well and to follow Jesus faithfully in a world that makes it very hard to follow after Jesus. And so we're going to be in this book for the next 6 weeks to gain this wisdom to follow after Jesus. Now, before we dive in, let me just give a very brief historical overview, a very brief historical background to this book so that we're all kind of on the same page. See, the book of Daniel opens up with the Babylonian Empire overtaking Israel. You see, in the 6th century BC, the Babylonians were a rising superpower in the ancient Near East. They had just defeated the reigning superstars at the time, the Assyrians. They'd also defeated the Egyptians in a major battle called the Battle of Carchemish. And after having defeated these other 2 major powers, the Babylonians were pretty much left open and free to overtake the ancient Near East, including Israel. And leading the Babylonians was a general named Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe his name sounds familiar, maybe it rings a bell. But under his leadership, the Babylonian Empire was expanding like crazy and eventually came to dominate the entire area, including Israel. And so Nebuchadnezzar has control over Israel, and his plan to really oversee Israel is to take the best and brightest of that youth, take the best and brightest youth and bring them to Babylon to train them in his Babylonian ways in order to use them for his Babylonian purposes. And among this group, the best and brightest who've been taken out of Jerusalem is a guy named Daniel. And that's where the book of Daniel opens up. See, this book is written by Daniel, and he wrote this book initially for Israelites who found themselves in a situation where the nations have pretty much overcome Israel, have pretty much defeated Israel. Right? Other nations have dominated them, and they are feeling utterly shocked. You see, God had promised Israel that he would make them a nation that would flourish, that this kingdom of Israel would be a kingdom that would last and be a blessing to the nations. But in their current situation, they feel like, man, God, what are you doing? Are you keeping your promises? Is our nation going to be, sustaining? Are we going to survive all of this? And so as they assess their situation, the book of Daniel is written to remind Israel that while the other nations seem to be dominating them, God is still sovereign over the nations. While the other nations seem to be in control over them, God is still carrying out his redemptive purposes, regardless of what the present circumstances seem to indicate. God's kingdom will come one day, and one day it will be fully established, and he will rule and reign over all the nations. And that's the major theme in the book of Daniel, that God is sovereign over the nations. God is sovereign over the course of history. And it's a very relevant message that I think we need to hear today. See, much like Daniel, I think we can find ourselves living in a foreign culture that is at odds with our Christian faith. We look at the world around us, and it's very difficult to be a Christian given the world that is around us. And in such a setting like our world, we can feel the pressure to move in one of 2 directions. See, for some of us, as we find ourselves in this foreign culture, we can move towards a mentality of being combative. Right? We can move towards a mentality of hunkering down and being combative, of isolating ourselves in a Christian bubble or fighting the culture wars. We can find ourselves being very combative. Or for others of us, given our circumstances, living in a foreign world, instead of being combative, we can find ourselves conforming to the world. Instead of combating the world, we can find ourselves conforming to the world, to looking like the world, to acting like the world, to loving the things that the world loves, to talking like the world, to valuing the things that the world values, right? To becoming just like the world. And in this foreign culture, we can find ourselves either moving towards being combative towards the world or towards conforming with the world. But the book of Daniel shows a better way. See, the book of Daniel shows how we can be in the world, but not of the world, so that we can impact the world with the gospel. The book of Daniel shows us how we can wisely live out our Christian faith in a foreign culture. And so, with that brief overview in mind, with that background in mind, let's dive in. If you have a Bible, if you can turn with me to the book of Daniel. We'll be looking at all of chapter 1 today. We'll be looking at a chapter a day for the next 6 weeks, starting with Daniel chapter 1. And the question we want to answer today is this. Right? This is the question. How can we as Christians pursue success in this world without compromising our faith? How can we as Christians follow after Jesus faithfully in this world? How can we wisely navigate our way through this foreign culture without giving up our Christian faith? Yes, it is okay to pursue success as a Christian. It's okay to want to be successful as a Christian, but we need to do so wisely. And so the question is, how? How can we do this well? To answer that question, we're going to take a look at Daniel chapter 1. To get us started, let me read for us verses 1 through 7. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. It says this. Now in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Pay attention to that. It's the Lord who gives Jehoiakim to Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to get back to that at the end of the sermon. Continuing on. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribes of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. All right, we're going to pause here just for a second. So Daniel chapter 1 opens up to what we briefly talked about regarding the historical background. Right? Nebuchadnezzar has been conquering left and right, just dominating all these nations, and now he has overtaken Israel. And in his effort to oversee the nation of Israel, he has a strategy. And the strategy is this. What he wants to do is he wants to take the best and brightest to groom them into his political puppets. So he takes those who have a royal background. He takes those who are physically fit. He takes those who are mentally strong. And Nebuchadnezzar knows if you want to take over a kingdom, you convert the king's sons. If you want to bring down a kingdom, you bring down the king's sons. And that's exactly what he plans to do. He wants to Babylonialize the future generation of Israelites by going after that future generation's most promising individuals. And within this group that has been brought over from Jerusalem into Babylon is Daniel and his 3 friends. Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. And as they find themselves in Babylon, they face great pressure to become Babylonian. As they've been brought out from Jerusalem and into Babylon, they face this great pressure to kind of go and get with the program. Now, to get a sense of this pressure that they're facing, we have to really recognize the situation that these young men find themselves in. See, first of all, they've just witnessed their nation get destroyed. And not just their nation, but it seems like God himself has been defeated. See, Nebuchadnezzar, he's gone into the temple in Jerusalem. He's defiled the holy objects of God, forcibly removed them from their rightful place, and he's placed them in the temple of his false and pagan god. This is an utter embarrassment. And it seems like the God of Jerusalem has been defeated by the God of Babylon. Secondly, these guys are young. I know when we think about Bible characters, we don't really think about their age, but these guys are young. In our best estimates, these guys are probably 14 or 15 years old. Hey, imagine being 14 or 15, being separated from your family, being removed out of your hometown, being sent off into a foreign land, and trying to figure things out on your own in this new place. And third of all, they find themselves not just in any old place, but they find themselves in Babylon. Daniel calls it the land of Shinar. This is a place known for their pagan idolatry and their false religion. According to the Bible, the land of Shinar is most notoriously known for being the place where the Tower of Babel was built all those years ago. The place where this monument to human ingenuity and human pride was lifted up. This is their new home. Fourth, They find themselves being immersed in the training of the Babylonians. See, not only are they learning the language of Babylon, but they're also learning the history and the culture and the worldview of the Babylonians. Their total understanding of how they think the world works is being challenged and reconstructed to match what the Babylonians think and believe. But if that's not enough, the cherry on top is this. Right? After all of this, personally, their names have been changed. For us today, for the most part, our names don't seem all that important. It's just, whatever your parents have called you or whatnot. But for the people of the ancient Near East, names were a big deal. Names were a very important part of their identity. Names said something about who you were. It said something about your family. It said something about your heritage. It said something about your beliefs. And here, the Israelite youth are given Babylonian names. Their old Israelite names had references to God, to Yahweh. But their new Babylonian names now have references to the false Babylonian gods. And so with all this going on, there is a great pressure to go with the flow. Right? Politically, Jerusalem is done. Geographically, these guys find themselves 1,000 miles away from home. Culturally, they're being inundated and flooded with information about the Babylonians. Professionally, they're being groomed into becoming political puppets for the Babylonian Empire. And personally, they have received new Babylonian names. There's a real pressure to adopt this new way of life, to make this foreign world their new home, to succeed in Babylon as Babylonians. And why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? It doesn't look like Jerusalem is going to overcome Babylon anytime soon. It seems like God has failed them. All the promises that he made to David about building up Israel as a kingdom that would bless the nations, all of that seems to have gone out the window, and the course of history seems to be flowing in Babylon's favor. Why shouldn't they take advantage of this opportunity? They're being offered a world-class education, right? A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have this world-class, top-notch career. Only a fool would waste this kind of potential. See, given the circumstances, it makes a lot of sense to call Babylon home, to get comfortable and cozy and say, you know what? This is my new place. You know what? These are my new people. You know what? These are my new gods. Given the circumstances, it makes a lot of sense to adopt this new pagan culture and to embrace their current situation. To do otherwise seems like a foolish task. It seems like you're fighting a losing battle. And I think in many ways, we can find ourselves feeling like Daniel and his friends in Babylon. We find ourselves living in a foreign world and feeling the pressure to succeed at all costs, to succeed in the ways that the world defines what success is. And maybe what compels us is maybe we think about all the sacrifices our parents have made to have us be where we finally are at. Or maybe what compels us is maybe we've bought into our culture's presentation of what life is supposed to be about, of what the good life entails, of what a life of satisfaction and fulfillment is all about. And we've drank that in and we've bought into that presentation. But in our world, in this foreign world, finding success is often at odds with remaining faithful to God. Being successful according to the world's definition of success is oftentimes fundamentally at odds with God's definition of success. The values of the world don't always match up to the values of God. And so, what do we do? What do we do? Let's take a look at what happens next. If you look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, I think we find something so insightful here. It says this in verse 8. It says, "But Daniel resolved," he set in his heart, literally set in his heart, he resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. This is a very interesting scenario. See, as part of their training, Daniel and his friends are offered food and wine from the king's table. Now, this is the good stuff, right? These are the luxurious cuts of meat. This is the finest wine that you could ever drink. See, most people back in the day didn't get to enjoy this kind of luxury. But here, for Daniel and his friends, it is offered to them straight from the king's table. The food that is so scrumptious and delicious, right? This is offered straight from the king's table. But Daniel declines. Instead, he makes the resolve to not eat the king's food or drink the king's wine. Now, for us, we might think, what's the big deal, right? It's just food. It's just meat. It's just wine, right? What's the big deal? If someone offered me a filet mignon, I'd be all over that, right? If someone offered me a Big Mac, I'd be all over that. It's just food. What's the big deal? But in this time and culture, food was not just food. It was not just for sustenance or for eating. But food served very important social and religious functions. See, socially, sharing food with someone was a sign of commitment. And in this case, with Daniel, taking food from the king's table was expressing allegiance to the king, saying, King, I am yours. I am your servant. I'm here to serve you. I'm here to live for you. My allegiance is to you and to you alone. But furthermore, religiously, food was often used as a sacrifice for the gods. You would offer up a piece of meat to this god or to that god, and then whatever was left over, you would eat that as an act of worship. And for Daniel, eating the food from the king's table would tie him to the religious worship of Babylon. That was a line that he could not cross. It says in verse 8, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. And for us, we probably won't find ourselves in a pagan temple anytime soon. We probably won't find ourselves offering up meat as a sacrifice to false idols anytime soon. But I think for us, we can run the risk of defiling ourselves as we adopt the values of the world. I think for some of us, we can find ourselves putting our ultimate trust in our Roth IRAs, putting our ultimate trust in our 401ks or in our bank accounts. We can find ourselves finding our ultimate worth in our career or our academic credentials or our family life. We can find ourselves making comfort the ultimate goal in our lives, to live a comfortable life, to have a comfortable retirement, to go on comfortable vacations, to have comfortable friends, and to just live a comfortable life. We can find ourselves enjoying the pleasures of the world so much and getting so used to it and saying, you know what? I can make this my home. You know what? This feels kind of nice. I can definitely get used to this. And much like Daniel, we need to intentionally be aware of the pressures that try to draw us away from the things of God. Now, this is not easy. For Daniel, this was a risky request. His refusal to eat from the king's table could be taken as a sign of treason or disobedience. Furthermore, this decision could jeopardize his chances for advancing in the king's court. Right? All the other youth from Jerusalem are gobbling up the food. Right? They're getting fat. They seem like they're doing fine. What if they eat and I don't? I'm just going to be at a disadvantage here. See, everything here pushes Daniel towards eating the king's food. But Daniel doesn't. Instead of eating meat and drinking wine from the king's table, Daniel instead asks for vegetables and water. And here we see the key to navigating the foreign world we find ourselves in. Right? It's not vegetables or water, but here's the key. Success in the world begins with surrender before God. Success in this world begins with surrender before God. Friends, our pursuit of success in our foreign culture needs to start with surrendering ourselves before God. See, for Daniel, not partaking in the king's food is an intentional act on his part to remind himself of who the true king is. It's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's God. I get my sustenance not from him, but from God. He's the one I pledge my allegiance to. He's the one that I serve. He's the king of the nations. It's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's God. Instead of getting comfortable off the king's food, Daniel intentionally pumps the brakes to keep his heart in check. And that's so important. I think so often for us, we pursue success in the world because that's what we've been told to do. Our parents tell us, be successful. That's what our colleges tell us to do. Be successful. That's what our companies tell us to do. Be successful. I think so often we find ourselves pursuing success in this world, but we do so without surrendering before God. We work so hard to be successful in this world, but we do so without surrendering before God. We all have goals in mind. Some of us have good goals. Some of us have great goals, lofty goals, impressive goals. We all have goals in our lives that we want to achieve, whether it's to become this or that, to become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it might be. And we can so easily find ourselves throwing ourselves into these things without surrendering before God. And so what do? We load ourselves up with classes and internships. We'll take out $250,000 in student loans. We'll worry ourselves to death as we pursue our careers. We'll give up everything that we have to build up our dream family or to secure our children's futures, all without surrendering before God. But success in the world begins with surrender before God. The reason why Daniel can surrender before God, even in such a drastic situation like his, is because Daniel recognizes who God is. Daniel recognizes that God is the sovereign king over the nations. Remember, Daniel finds himself exiled. Jerusalem has lost. He is now in Babylon, 1,000 miles away from home. It does not seem like Jerusalem is going to overcome Babylon anytime soon. He's being brainwashed and trained to become a Babylonian diplomat, to be a puppet for King Nebuchadnezzar, without any signs of things ever changing ever again. And yet Daniel recognizes that God is in control. If you remember back to verse 2, Daniel makes it explicitly clear that the fall of Jerusalem was not due to Nebuchadnezzar. It was not ultimately due to his armies or to his might or to his strategy or to his nation's resources. The fall of Jerusalem was not due to Nebuchadnezzar, but it was ultimately due to God. Nebuchadnezzar did not take Jerusalem. God gave it to him. It was the Lord that placed Daniel into the situation. See, Daniel knows the sovereignty of God. Daniel knows that God is in control, and because Daniel knows that, Daniel can surrender. He doesn't need to play by the rules of the world. He doesn't need to value the things that the world values. He doesn't need to find success as the world defines success. He can look at all of the glitz and the glamour that is offered by the world, that is advertised to us as, if you try this or eat this or buy this or wear this or have this, then you will be fulfilled. He can look at all of that and say, you know what? I don't need it. Daniel can surrender. And for us too, as we meditate upon God's sovereignty, we can surrender. And we can actively pursue surrender before God in lots of different ways. See, surrendering before God can look like starting each day in the Word, being reminded of His character and His promises and His purposes, being reminded that He is for you. Surrendering before God can look like going before God in prayer and laying down before Him all of our burdens, our hopes, our fears, our dreams, our desires, our plans. It can look like fasting from certain things that draw our hearts away from God. It can look like being generous with what we have and investing these things towards God's kingdom purposes. It can look like pausing and asking ourselves, why am I doing what I am doing? Surrendering before God looks like being faithful in the small things. Being faithful before God in a job that is not your dream job, in a job that does not pay well, in a job that seems to be a dead end, in a job that seems like, what am I doing here? Being faithful before God means being faithful in the small things in your home or in the church. Surrendering before God looks like being faithful in the private things. It's being faithful before God even when no one else is watching, even when no one else is going to give you recognition. Surrendering before God looks like saying no to sin, to pursue after holiness in a world that says run after pleasure, to not compromise your integrity in making your way through the world. We are to surrender before God if we want to successfully navigate our way through the world. And as Daniel surrenders before God, God actually blesses Daniel with success. If you take a look at verses 17 to 21, the last part of our passage for today, this is what happens. It says this. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. See, Daniel finds success under God's gracious provision. In the course of 3 years, throughout their training, Daniel and his friends go from being at the very bottom as exiles in a foreign world to standing and working in front of the king in his court. They are elevated to positions of influence and strategically placed by God to make an impact on the Babylonians. Now, I need to be clear here. Surrendering before God does not mean that we will always find worldly success. I need to be clear. Just because we surrender our lives and our vision and our plans and our dreams before God does not necessarily mean that God will bless our lives in such a way that things will work out always in the way that we want them to work out. Surrendering before God is not some magic trick to manipulate God into making things go smoothly for us. Rather, surrendering before God helps us to understand what true success in the world looks like. And what's true success? God's definition of true success is this. True success is faithfully fulfilling God's purposes in your life for His great glory and for the good of others. True success is faithfully fulfilling God's purposes in your life for His great glory and for the good of others. It's living a life surrendered to God for His purposes. Success in the world can look like packing your bags and moving to Guatemala for 15 years to love and serve orphans who have been abandoned and left behind instead of buying into the American dream or the Korean dream. It can look like working hard at odd jobs to make ends meet in order to house and clothe and feed these children that they have brought in under their care. It can look like shedding blood and sweat and tears for years to empower a community to rally around building a school in order to educate the future generation to have a better opportunity. Missionary Lee and Missionary Jang, which we heard about in the Guatemala testimonies, are successful in the eyes of God no matter what the world may think, no matter what the world may say. Surrendering before God helps us to understand what true success in the world looks like. And furthermore, surrendering before God guarantees that we will handle success well, whether it comes or whether it does not come. See, surrendering before God keeps us humble when success comes. We recognize that all of our success is of God's grace and for God's purposes. And so if success comes in the form of great wealth, in the form of a great job, in the form of great influence or whatever, surrendering before God helps us to use those gifts well, not for our own glory, but for His glory alone. And surrendering before God keeps us from being hopeless when success does not come. We recognize that God is at work even when things don't seem to be working out. We can remain faithful in less than ideal situations, knowing that God is in control. Surrendering before God helps us to understand what true success in the world looks like and how to rightly respond, whether success comes or whether success does not come. And here, God does give Daniel success in Babylon. And I love how chapter 1 ends. With a very brief comment, we see in verse 21 that Daniel outlasts Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel outlives Nebuchadnezzar. While Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire seem so powerful, so unstoppable, they are merely brief footnotes in God's history. God is working through His people, even in exile, to carry out His great purposes. And for us, as we strive for success in this world to be used for God's purposes, and we first start by surrendering before God. God, here is my life. Use it for what you will. Here are my plans, my resources, my hopes, my dreams, my vision, my goals, my future. Use it for what you will. And as we seek to do so, may we look beyond Daniel to the greater Daniel, Jesus Christ, who surrendered all before God to bring ultimate success in this world through the cross. May we, as followers of Christ, live out that gospel in our lives. If you can bow your heads with me at this time, spend some time in prayer and reflection before God. Would you be honest with your own heart? And really weigh if you've been surrendering yourself before God. With all the pressure to succeed, with all the pressure to make it big in the world according to the world's definition, would you take some time now to surrender yourself before the Lord? The plans that you hold on to, the dreams that you dream, the hopes that you live for, would you bring that to Him? If you've been feeling the pressures of this world, would you come before the true King and be reminded of His sovereignty? And as you're reminded of all that God is, would you be able to gladly, willingly surrender yourself before Him? Let's respond to God in prayer and reflection at this time.